Hey guys, Maniac here with GamingSets.net doing another site podcast. This week we're going to be doing the most popular and most requested podcast topic. We're going to be talking about Wolfenstein for the PC. Now, Wolfenstein was probably, as far as I'm concerned, the perfect game released at the perfect time. It was developed by id Software, published by Apogee, later 3D Realms. It was developed, if my memory serves, it was the last game that was developed by the original 5 developers at id Software. The original developers, Kevin Cloud, John Carmack, Adrian Carmack, John Romero, and Tom Hall. Yes, those, as far as I'm concerned, were 5 of the brightest minds on the planet at the time. They had broken off because John Carmack had developed the original engine for the original Commander Keen series. And armed with the backing of many popular developers at Apogee Software, who were very popular for their own series, and armed with the 3-episode shareware model, they had the potential to do a lot with this game. And these guys pretty much just revolutionized the whole world. I mean, the original Wolfenstein was probably revolutionary. Now, Scott Miller, who was the guy working at Apogee at the time, had determined that the best way to sell video games and the best way to sell pretty much any type of software was on the shareware system. This was at a time that predated a wide, high-speed internet service. There still were independently connected computer services that you could access through the phone lines and things like this, and people could dial up other people's computers and access shared data remotely. But it wasn't very fast. And because of that, you couldn't put a lot of complex data on there. I say nothing of the fact of that hard drives were sparse. People were still using floppy disks. CD drives were still read-only. And pretty much everybody was using DOS. That the time was kind of interesting for developers. Software developers were, with the exception of the really, really big companies, had the potential for major improvements at that point. Basically, if somebody, the overhead was so low that basically a guy or a bunch of guys working in their office on overtime, or a bunch of guys if they had the computers already at home, with no overhead whatsoever, could basically start their own business, create a product, get it published or publish it themselves, and simply go to any computer store and because they were independently run, offer to publish their wares or ship their wares, and the publisher would, the retailer would be more than happy to stock if they felt that the product was good and could sell. So this was probably one of the best times you could possibly have for PC gaming, because the market was there. The distribution network was ready to be developed. All you basically needed was word of mouth could do a lot. There wasn't a lot out there. And people wanted product. Retailers wanted product. Computer owners wanted product. They wanted to do more with their computers than just, deal with spreadsheets or type up letters to the Tooth Fairy or something like that. They wanted games. That's really how you sell a system. With all that in mind, the shareware system was born. And it was basically created by a guy who determined, you know what, I'll write a program, I'll make it good, and then I'll basically tell people that if they either want, tech support, or if they want better stuff, they can just give me money for it. They can get it for free, either through their friends, or they can get it through my servers or my computers or whatever. And if they like it, they'll give me money for it. And it worked really well for him. He could sell office software, and he could get money back from it from people that would use it and enjoy it. The problem was that the shareware system didn't work too much for gaming. Gamers were a different breed. We're the kind of people that we're young, we don't have a lot of money. So unless we're forced to buy something, we really don't want to buy something. And it was Scott Miller who determined that really, if you're going to adapt the shareware method to games, you had to withhold the majority of the game. Basically, release, a game, cut it in thirds, release the first third for free, and then charge people for the other two. You still wouldn't get 100% of the people to pay, but if the original episode was widely distributed, you had a better chance of people. You'd have more chances of people to see it, or you have more chances of people to pay. Even if your revenue for buying was like 3 or 5% or something like that, if the 100% is a large number, then you could actually and you charged a reasonable price, you could recoup your development costs, which were very, very low at the time. Basically, a guy working at home could basically do this kind of stuff. And id Software tested this when they developed their first game series, which was the Commander Keen series. And with the help of Apogee, they released the game in the shareware model and did extremely well because, well, first off, no one had ever seen a game like Commander Keen before on the PC, and the game did quite well. And finally, it came to id Software, and they realized, well, what do we do next? And id Software had always been fans of this classic game for the PC or Mac or called Castle Wolfenstein. It was actually one of the original games that they had played that kind of inspired them to get into game development. And they thought to themselves, you know what? Maybe we could do like a remake of Castle Wolfenstein, or we could try to license Castle Wolfenstein. And they had figured out that the person who developed the original Wolfenstein name, who had trademarked the name, had let the trademark lapse. And because of that, they could publish the game and call it Wolfenstein. But they decided to call it Wolfenstein 3D. Yes, they were going to be releasing a 3D action game. And this was going to be a game in which nobody had ever really seen before. They had decided that if we're going to release this game, we're going to go all out. We're going to make something offensive, practically. And the more offensive, the better. I mean, when you think about it, Castle Wolfenstein, or the idea of Wolfenstein, is quite offensive to a lot of people. The terms of, and I don't mean to offend anybody when I'm talking about these terms, but just the idea of fighting Nazis in general, the whole thing that promotes is quite controversial, especially if not dealt with lightly. However, they weren't afraid. They weren't afraid of striking up controversy. And in a lot of cases, developers don't care. And publishers learn this more. Sometimes the more controversial you get, even if people hate you, you still basically just equal popularity for them. And sometimes that's what they want. Sometimes people being offended sells. So, I mean, to be perfectly honest, though, I think this was not only when it came down to the whole idea behind it, was something of more heroic than anything else. And this is something that a lot of people don't really talk about when it comes to video games. I mean, this was probably where the whole start of violent video games came from. And to be perfectly honest, you were being a hero. I mean, all the people that people will usually decry of being violent video games and stuff like that, they neglect to mention that in most of the cases of all of these games, and I think that probably Wolfenstein 3D was the start of it, you're playing the good guy. Yes, you're doing, yes, you're killing other people, but in most cases it's self-defense. Or in most cases it's you're killing terrorists, as an army guy, or you're killing enemy soldiers in a war. Or you're killing demons, or monsters. I really don't know where the controversy could come from such a thing. I mean, are you going to argue that demons are people too? Or monsters? Or bips and boops, for that matter? And by that, of course, I mean, computer bits. I don't think that killing Nazis was controversial, or should have been considered controversial. because otherwise, then what happened in World War II, basically? Then there would have been a huge controversy over the fact that World War II happened, that sort of thing. And I honestly don't think there's ever been a controversy about that, nor should there be. I mean, it happened, you know. So here they were, basically making a game that was going to be controversial, but in the right way. And because of that, armed with the 5 developers that id Software had, each one had a chance to play to his strengths. And I can't say that really about any of the other games that it developed. I mean, Tom Hall would leave after this game, but he was more than happy to do it. I mean, he liked, basically this was the perfect game where you had the 5 minds get together and they could each play to their strengths. Adrian Carmack had the ability to create all the art styles that he wanted, even to pick things of torture and stuff like that. He would have more of a better chance of doing it in Doom. But for the most part, he had the chance of really starting to stretch his stuff. John Carmack had the ability to push the technology that he had developed up to its absolute limit with some of the other developers that they had. Like the game designers like John Romero and stuff like that were able to bring in things like the push walls. John Romero pleaded with the push walls. And finally, Carmack relented. And if John Romero wasn't there to argue for the push walls, it might not have even happened. We might not have even had the secret push walls. So, you had that. Tom Hall got to create the things like the chicken dinners and stuff like that, and of course, don't get me started on the idea of fighting the dogs. But basically, you had a game where everybody could do their best. Everybody could basically contribute, and because id Software was probably made up of some of the brightest minds in the game development industry at that time, it just did really well for everyone. I had first become aware of Wolfenstein probably around, I don't know, maybe around 1993, 1994 or so. I didn't have my first computer until 1996, Christmas 1996, as I'm sure many of you know. And so that pretty much came right after those days of Wolfenstein. It was long after the days of Wolfenstein. That was probably around the early days of Quake. But I remembered having family friends that had a PC. They were pretty technologically oriented. They had a Super Nintendo. They had they also had a pretty high-end multimedia PC at the time. CD-ROM drive and everything. And I brought over a computer game that I was trying to get to work because I had picked it up, but the system that I just couldn't get it to run on any of the systems. And we couldn't get it to work because, I don't know, it must have gotten reformatted or something. And they had recommended to cheer me up to try Wolfenstein out. And so I did. And I said, really? It's like, no. You gotta try this game, Maniac. You really gotta try this game. This was back before I was even called Maniac. You gotta try this game, they said. It's crazy. So I said, okay. So they loaded up the game for me, and I don't remember if it was the shareware, but I was definitely playing the shareware episodes. And I started playing through Wolfenstein, and I'm like, I'm moving through hallways. I'm shooting Nazis. I'm picking up guns. This is a game. Awesome. Absolutely awesome. I don't care if the technology was primitive. I don't care if the game, but as far as I'm concerned, the gameplay was pretty much universal. It was the first game that I had seen that had taken real advantage of this kind of technology. And I think that it made everyone see the PC in a whole new light, at least the people that had seen it. I'm sure that the people who never saw it probably still thought of the PC in their own way. But I think this was the first time that anybody that it could be exposed to could see the PC in an entirely new light, see the PC capable of action gaming and things like this. He just hadn't seen the PC in that way before. There were other games that were coming out, but for the PC, obviously the PC had always had the text adventures, and the PC had always had adventure games later on, even graphic adventure games. But nothing that seemed as real time in 3D, able to move through 3D space and stuff like that. It was just, and violent. I mean, most of the games that we had seen up to that point were either funny or they would leave the violence to your imagination or something like that, and you'd never actually see the violence on the screen. Wolfenstein did that. And I remember the first time I remember when I finally did get my own computer. I I had a demo disc that was released with it that was like, I don't know, like 100 shareware games and stuff like that. This was back when shareware was just on its way out. I think Quake was like the last major shareware game. But the PC that I came with this sampler disc with all these DOS emulated games and stuff like that. And I remembered playing. I remember Wolfenstein was in the disc. Was on the CD-ROM. The downside of it was that because it stayed on the disc, I couldn't save my spot or anything like that. Or I'd lose my spot at the end. But it worked pretty well on the computer. But I could remember I could never make it past the last boss. I think the farthest I ever made it was I'd make it to the last boss of the first episode, and I'd die and lose all my guns. And I either never saved or something along those lines. But I just remember that being very difficult. And and I never could make it back to the final boss because I'd usually get lost in the maze or something like that. I'd not be able to find a certain key, or I'd never be able to progress very far. There'd be like one really complex level I could never get through. I could never find my way through or something, and I'd eventually either die or get bored. And nowadays, I guess those kind of games are like a novelty. Most games will actually hold your hand through them or something like that. But back then, games like Wolfenstein or Doom even or Duke Nukem 3D were almost set up like mazes where good luck trying to figure your way through them without a walkthrough or something. Or some kind of map because they were big, they were labyrinthian. And without a help guide or something like that, you get lost or not be able to figure out how to continue very easily. So years passed, and I started upgrading. I got into the PC, but I got into the PC really bad, and I'd be playing it left and right. And id Software after Wolfenstein pretty much stopped doing the Wolfenstein games. They didn't really do Wolfenstein after that. They did Doom, they did Doom 2, and then they moved on to the Quake games. They did Quake, they did Quake 2, they did Quake 3 Arena, they did Quake 3 Team Arena, and then they do Doom 3. But somewhere during the development after Quake 3 Arena, but before Doom 3, id Software kind of sort of had something extra with the Quake engine. They started making a lot of money with the licensing options for the engines themselves. Particularly the Quake 3 Arena engine, they made pretty good bank on. They did claim that they did make more money off the games than they did off the engine licensing, but you know what? That's neither here nor there. And they don't license their engines anymore, especially after Bethesda bought them. So, yeah, after all these years, everyone starts thinking maybe that Wolfenstein is just a dead franchise because, id Software was really the only people that could make the Wolfenstein game, and they weren't. I mean, they were a one project house, and they'd always be working on something else. They went from Wolfenstein, they went straight into Doom. Then they did Doom 2. They did Quake 1, Quake 2, Quake 3 Arena, Quake 3 Team Arena, and then they went straight into Doom 3. But somewhere during the development between Quake 3 Team Arena and Doom 3 was a pretty good stretch of years. It was about, I don't know, I think it was about 4 years since announcement to release for Doom 3. And along the time, that wasn't really all that id was doing. It was, for the first time ever, really experimenting with licensing out their properties because their properties were quite valuable. And they weren't a very big development house. To this day, they're not really that big a development house. And they were independently operated at the time. So nobody could make an id property game except it. And if you wanted to, well, you were going to have to ask. And it got to a point where somebody asked. And I think it was Splash Damage who went to id and they said, look, we want to make a Wolfenstein game. We want to make a new Wolfenstein game. And because like Wolfenstein was like, the father of, the first person shooter. People missed the property. It should come back. And it let him do it. Armed with the Quake 3 Arena engine, Return to Castle Wolfenstein came out. And it was a big, big hit. I mean, it did some co-development on that one, but I remembered when the demo got released thinking, all right, we're back. It's fantastic. It's great that this is back. And I remembered picking up like the Game of the Year edition or something like that later on. And a problem was I never beat it. I thought the graphics were great for the Quake 3 engine. I thought how do I put this? I guess I thought the environments were kind of just, I don't know. There's something about the environments that just kind of felt boring after a while. So either that or I got stuck in a level or something like that. I can't quite remember. But I never beat the game. But it was fantastic and it worked great for id because of a lot of reasons. One, it brought id back while they were developing something else. So everyone was talking about id's properties again. It did a great job showcasing the Quake 3 Arena engine on a non-Quake 3 Arena game. And probably helped in the sale of licenses and stuff like that. Because the Quake 3 Arena engine was probably one of the most licensed engines that it did. I don't think that there were any other engines that they sold licenses to as much as that engine. It just seemed like for a while that that engine was ending up in a lot of games, and like I think the first one to use it that wasn't it was probably Raven when they made Elite Force. But Raven alone made a bunch of Quake 3 engine games, like Soldier of Fortune 2 and stuff, and Jedi Outcast, and Jedi Outcast sequel, Jedi Academy, stuff like that. So there were a lot of major pluses to Return to Castle Wolfenstein's release. Now, everyone is probably going to say, what everyone is thinking that they're going to say is that, well, Return to Castle Wolfenstein was also the birth of, inadvertently, a whole other franchise. You see, because what had happened was that the developers wanted to make an expansion pack to Return to Castle Wolfenstein, like a multiplayer expansion pack, so that they could have new game types and everything else. And they called it Enemy Territory. The problem with it was that either the developers realized that what they had they couldn't sell, or they just didn't have enough. But it was just so much fun to play that kind of just out of goodwill, they just decided to release it for free. And if I remember correctly, they also made it standalone. So they're like, look, we were working on a game. We decided not to, go forward with it. Here's the game. Enjoy. Here's what we made. And Return to Castle Enemy Territory, Wolfenstein Enemy Territory was a huge, huge hit on the PC market. I mean, when you think about it like this was practically like nobody had really seen stuff like this before. I mean, obviously, DLC and patches and stuff like that were constantly being released for games, but they would have required to have the games in the first place. You would not normally find a developer or a publisher just release a standalone game client for free, unless there was some other way that they can make a profit off of it. Nowadays, if they do, they still figure out some way to make a profit off of it. If something is released for free, they usually charge for like extra skins, or they'll charge for extra maps, or they'll charge for extra access to extra features, or it'll be a massively multiplayer game where you could, charge for items, that sort of thing. Wolfenstein Enemy Territory was a free game in pretty much the respect of the word. You didn't pay anything for it, you played it. So because it was free, it had a lot of players. And also because it was free, it was easy to get. I mean, anybody with a PC could download it, with PC internet access. It had the Quake 3 system specs, which were not that high by the time that got released. A lot of people met those requirements. I mean, nowadays, if a game comes out, maybe about not even half of new computers will be able to play it. But back then you'd be able to play you would be able to play this, and it was fun. And I think what a lot of people would probably appreciate more than anything was that it pretty much started the Enemy Territory franchise, which would later get used in for Quake Wars, basically. Now, I'm not going to go too much further into the Enemy Territory line because I already talked about it in my Quake podcast, and you can hear more about that in the Quake podcast. But Wolfenstein was back. So everyone is still probably playing Enemy Territory Quake Wars Enemy Territory Wolfenstein probably to this day. I'm sure that a lot of people are probably still playing it. But that was pretty much it for the Wolfenstein franchise for a while, at least. But to be perfectly honest, it was a pretty good, that release was a pretty good way to end it right there. Or at the very least to just leave off. Here you had a free game that had a great multiplayer client to it. So, Doom 3 comes out. Or I should say, Doom 3 was starting to get pegged to getting released. And over the time of promotion, the CEO, I'm sorry, I believe he was the CEO, Todd Hollinshed from id, let it slip during a interview with G4 back when it was a good station that they already were in the process of doing another Wolfenstein game in another studio. And G4 actually preempted, when they had that interview, they were going to put it in, I think it was the making of Doom 3 or the Doom Icons episode. And they actually aired it on their news show, which I believe was called Pulse at the time. And they say, yeah, we haven't aired this special yet, but listen to what we caught Hollinshed saying. And out came this, this line. It's like, we're not currently doing another Wolfenstein game. He was basically prefacing that they were going to do a whole new franchise after Doom 3, which later, of course, became Rage. But he says, no, we're not going to do another Wolfenstein game that's already in development in another development house. That was big news. That was like, oh, wow. We weren't expecting you to say that. That hadn't been announced yet. Maybe Hollinshed didn't know that, oh, by the way, we had forgotten to announce that. But really nobody, that was like the last we actually heard about it. Everyone kind of assumed maybe Splash Damage was doing it again. Would it be using the Quake 3 engine, or would it be using the Doom 3 engine? They just really didn't know. But it was something. And then Doom 3 comes out, and everyone starts talking about it. And after that, it starts working development on Rage. But in the meantime, everyone started focusing on some of the other games that were coming out from which would basically be using the Doom 3 engine. And Quake 4 comes out from Raven. I liked it. I thought it was kind of short, but I think I beat it in one night, but I liked it. But so that was pretty much I think that was released a year after Doom 3. I think Quake 4 came out. I think it was 2005 about Quake 4. Now I know I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I'm trying to remember the timeline exactly for when the Wolfenstein game came out. I believe Wolfenstein came out at around the time about 2009 or so. Now, when the new Wolfenstein game did come out, it was released on the PC, the Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 3. It was using the Doom 3 engine. I got to admit, I have a copy of it on the PC. I never played it. I don't know what it was, but I remember the reviews of it were kind of lukewarm at best. And I don't know why, but I just never really had a chance for bringing myself to play it. And even today, right now, my computer has a busted GPU. I would love to have played it for this podcast, but my busted GPU just would not be able to run it, and it would probably just crash my system. So yeah, that's kind of like a sour note for me to end that on. But I think that was the last time we really heard from the Wolfenstein franchise. It was kind of on a dull note because it came out at a time when the PC was really falling backwards. The next generation consoles had taken over pretty much from the PC, And it's and it was before the Rage engine. I think it would have probably helped if like it came out so close to the release of Rage that everyone was kind of expecting that if they were going to do it, they were going to have to do it on the Rage engine probably. In order to get it to work really well, and they didn't do that. It was still using Doom 3, which still is a pretty powerful engine. But Doom 3 came out in 2004. I mean, there was a lot of engines that have been released since then. And, it would have had better graphics. Even the Rage engine would have worked. I mean, and by that point, of course, you already had the mega texture technology and you had all this other stuff. And I'm sure that all went into it, but I think that it just got released too late. I think if they had released it sooner, it probably would have come out at a better time. And I think that was, if I remember correctly, the last we really heard from Wolfenstein. But not exactly. That was the last we kind of heard from Wolfenstein in the retail space. Enter the iPhone. I mean, Apple back in 2007 announces that, yeah, we're making a phone. Yeah, you'll be able to watch movies on it. You'll be able to browse the internet on it. You'll be able to make calls on it. Yeah, it's a phone and an iPod, and it's got a touch screen, and it's got all this cool stuff, and you can keep it in your pocket. You can browse the internet. You can take text messages. All this good stuff. And this was beyond what we had seen in the United States. I've heard for a long time that cell phones in other countries other than the United States were actually pretty advanced, and it was actually the cell phone companies that were keeping a lot of these great features away from us. And it was probably that was the reason why. I mean, Apple had said that they were trying to make a phone for a while, and pretty much the majority of all the cell phone providers just pretty much rejected them because Apple only wanted to play by their own rules. And the cell phone providers most of them just didn't care. And they just didn't want to support this, support which was, let's be honest, a pretty revolutionary product. Nowadays, pretty much all cell phones, or certainly all the smartphones, are all at least designed either to complement the iPhone's features or to enhance the iPhone's features, or the iPhone itself. Basically, is basically it. So at that time, it pretty much became a great haven for games because here you had all these cell phones, which were pretty simple at the time, and finally, with the release of like the iPhone 3G, you had a chance to not only get a decent phone with a decent cellular band, but it was affordable. Granted, you'd have to pay for a contract with it and everything else, but they really nailed the pricing with contract, and because of that, it made it for a great opportunity for these games to come back, for a lot of retro games to be ported over to the new system. Enter Wolfenstein coming back on the iPhone. I think I remembered paying my $5 for it and downloading it at work like the second it came out. And I remembered playing the heck out of every single episode that was released for that game until I defeated Hitler. Yeah. I gotta say, it was great to have Wolfenstein portable. I actually beat every single episode that they had released for it. I thought it was just awesome. I was so happy about that. They also released, I believe, the Wolfenstein RPG, which was kind of a extension of their success. I think it was the Doom RPG. The original Doom RPG was released for basic handsets. And I remembered enjoying the first one quite a bit. But they never ported the original Doom RPG to the smartphone. It was just on the older phones. There was later, I believe, the Doom 2 RPG came out. And the Wolfenstein RPG came out to smartphones. But that was about it. And that was exciting. I think they kind of kept kind of like a mix between how Wolfenstein originally looked and like the Castle Wolfenstein look. I think they kind of converted some of the textures to sprites and everything else, and the way they had you move around in the 3D world and stuff like that. I thought it worked pretty well. Didn't play it that much, but I do remember. I honestly think that really the handsets were probably where you could really find Wolfenstein in its classic. You can download Wolfenstein, the original Wolfenstein, to your iPhone and play it. And it's just great. And I think that was also the jumping point for id Mobile, because here was John Carmack, doing some stuff he did before, like, designing his next project, and he had the free time because I believe the Rage engine was already done by that point, and so he needed something to do, and so he's like, okay, I'm going to make my engines work on these little handsets, and he developed, the groundwork with pretty much the Wolfenstein, with the Wolfenstein port for later id Software mobile releases, which were very high quality and were great were great portable games. And I thought it was fantastic that they brought them over, because Wolfenstein iPhone version at least brought that all over. It all started with that, and then later they were doing this. I don't think there's really been too many id Software releases since they got bought out by Bethesda to the mobile phones. But then again, id is kind of going dark right now because they're probably in the still in the development phases, or the early development phases of their next major game. So pretty much all hands are on deck for what this next game that they're working on is going to be under Bethesda's flag, which is cool, which is fine. You can do that, certainly. I think that's fine. So, what do we have to look forward for Wolfenstein? Well, right now, as far as I know, there really hasn't been too much music coming out for another Wolfenstein game. If there was, I probably would mention it. If they did, they probably would use the Rage engine. Now, obviously, Wolfenstein is now owned by Bethesda. The Wolfenstein license is owned by Bethesda. So it would either be done by, and Bethesda has said on several occasions, we're not licensing these properties out. We are going to keep them in-house. We're not licensing the technology out either. We're keeping it all in-house. So it's highly unlikely that Bethesda will choose another developer to take one of their licensed properties that they got from id and have somebody either other than id or other than themselves working on it. Maybe they would have somebody that they owned, like a company that they own, do it. But a highly, it would be. I would find it unlikely that they would have just some studio, come back and do it, because that's money. That's money. It's a very popular franchise. It goes back to the early days of the PC. And that's important. That's like, when everybody talks about Wolfenstein, everyone knows what I'm talking about. Everyone. It's like, oh yeah, that game, id Software made it, and it's shooting Nazis and everything. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the seminal properties of the gaming landscape. And it was one of the few games that were originally on the PC that everyone really remembers. I can't usually say that about a lot of PC games. A lot of PC games, especially back in the day, nobody remembers because, everyone remembers the console games. But nowadays, yeah, everyone still remembers Wolfenstein. And it'd be nice to have a new Wolfenstein game come out, maybe using the Rage engine. That would be unbearably awesome. But right now, I think that the next major Rage-related game, or Rage engine-related game, is probably going to be Doom 4, which nobody has seen anything of. Every year they say, oh, we'll show it next QuakeCon, and then every next QuakeCon comes out and they don't show it. So if they're in kind of a development trouble with Doom 4, they're probably going to be in a development struggle for if they're going to do a next Wolf. It's probably going to be a while before we see another Wolfenstein game, which is kind of unfortunate. We probably would see a Wolfenstein movie maybe before we saw that. I thought that, I think a Wolfenstein movie would probably work pretty well. So, those are my ideas, guys. That's my podcast on Wolfenstein. I'd like to hear your comments on it. This was the most requested podcast, actually, in quite a while, and I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. Next time on podcasts, oh gosh, what should I talk about next time? I had some ideas actually for my next podcasts early on, and then I started coming up with some whole new ideas for podcasts. So I kind of really don't want to say what my next podcast is going to be, because sometimes when I say that, I either will change my mind and I'll get like another podcast idea in my mind or something like that. But there will be more podcasts coming. And I will talk to you guys later. I hope you enjoyed it. Please post a comment. Till next time, guys, this is Maniac with GameAccess.net Over and out.